Hello and welcome to another episode of the AgNext Podcast, where we are always excited to tell you next about AgNext. I'm one of your co-hosts, Pedro Carvalho.
And another co-host, Kim.
Today, we have the pleasure to be speaking with an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science and Animal Welfare and Behavior Specialist, Dr. Lily Edwards-Callaway. Let's get into it. Welcome, Dr. Edwards-Callaway. We appreciate you bringing you to the podcast today. We want to give a little moment for you to introduce yourself and talk about your job and what you do, your personal background, education, career, and what drew you to your work today on animal behavior and welfare.
Okay, thank you for having me. That's a lot to say in one moment, but I'll do my best. So I am an associate professor here. I do a little bit of teaching, a lot of research, and some outreach. So research is my favorite part of my job. I love studying animal welfare and seeing how we can make improvements in our systems. I did not grow up in agriculture, although I realized at the Women in Ranching event, I'm about hitting the balance point where I've been in it maybe longer than not, just because of how old I'm getting. But I grew up in Rhode Island, so like small agriculture, it's not what I did. It's not what my family did. So really all my exposure to all things ag was when I moved out to Colorado for my PhD. So I have a Bachelor of Arts in French. I should have taken Spanish because I'm actually taking Spanish now. But I, wanted to be a doctor and got discouraged by physics. Decided there must be, or actually at that point I was like, there's nothing else I can do in science, which is really silly. So I majored in French. It just wasn't the right fit. I tried working in a vet clinic, again, not the right fit. And I just really wanted to do something bigger, to make a bigger impact and improve the lives of animals. And so I think that's like what drew me to agriculture. Mm-hmm. My advisor at the time was like, for my master's was like, hey, have you ever heard of Temple Grandin? And like, sadly at that point in my life, I had not. And so I read one of her books and I was like, wow, this is pretty straightforward and simple, but genius. And so I called her up to see if she had a space out here for me to come get my PhD. And the rest is like a little bit history, right? I work in the space of mostly kind of end of life decision making. It started as kind of pre-slaughter stress. And so that's, I guess, how I got here today.
Cool. Let's go back a little bit. I was curious when you said like you want to be a doctor. Were you thinking about being a vet, or just a human? Like
a human doctor is how I started. So I was pre-med at a liberal arts college, and I took the biologies, the chemistries I could get through. It was the physics that just like killed me. So.
And what did you do your master's on? Just curious.
It was animal science. So it was at the University of Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. So that department is like the Department of like fisheries, animal and pre-vet science. So it's really fish heavy. Mm-hmm. So there were only 2 people working on mammals. And I was one of them, and I actually studied zoo animals. So it wasn't even livestock related, but it was applicable. So it was looking at cotton-top tamarins. And for zoos, behavioral monitoring is really important. And so it was like, how can you watch the animals for the least amount of time, but get the most information to kind of help inform enrichment programs for them?
Was there any specific animal that you were?
Yeah, the monkeys. Yeah. So I watched like 290 hours of monkeys.
That's
impressive. Cool. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, I was. And one last question that I'm curious on, were you exposed to research as an undergrad? How, you want to be a vet, then you had a challenge with physics. Yeah. And how did you start considering grad school? And were you thinking about becoming a professor later, or you just say, let's see what's going to happen and go?
No, I didn't. So, I went to a liberal arts school, and the way that they did advising, I had an advisor that wasn't part of my major. So my advisor was a Russian literature major. Or professor. And so I took a lot of Russian literature, which is kind of it was good, but I think that advising piece was missing a little bit, and saying like, hey, there's other things that you can do with science. So I did, as an undergrad, have the opportunity to work on a sheep farm. I did a lot more with the vegetables actually, but I think I got that initial exposure, but I never did research as an undergrad. I took a job after I finished with my French degree, and I just came back because I was like, what should I do? I don't want to go to veterinary school. like, what about getting a master's? But I really didn't have that back experience. So I just like showed up to the department and said, hey, I'm a French major. I want to study llamas. Can you please take me? And they were like, you're crazy. Please go take anatomy and physiology and organic chemistry. And then I got accepted.
That's cool. That's pretty cool. So yeah, so now
that is cool.
Yeah.
So clearly research is something that you love and started loving early in your career with 290 hours. Is that what you said?
Yeah, monkeys.
Of primates. Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah. So when you think about your research today, what does welfare mean to you in that research, and how do you evaluate welfare in research?
Yeah. So those are good and hard questions. So I think one thing that I didn't really share, I worked in industry for a while, which I know, you know, and we overlapped at a couple locations, but I learned there that you really have to show kind of how what you do impacts the bottom line. I think everybody wants to do the right thing for animal welfare, but if you can show that economic incentive to do something, it makes it a lot easier sell. And so I think that my experience in industry was invaluable. So I think it's really, really shaped how I do my research now. So I look for very practical solutions to improve welfare, but also economics, which I think obviously are components of sustainability. And so, I guess thinking about what animal welfare means to me, I think it means doing the best we can for the animal in the situation that we have. So providing it opportunities that it can thrive and not be stressed, and hopefully give it opportunities for good things in its life too. I think it's a little hard sometimes because I work a lot at slaughter plants. And so sometimes I think it's almost opposite, right? But I think if we think about that last kind of really critical part of an animal's life, I think it's really important to consider its welfare at that stage.
And how does that translate to economics, Lily? And you could use that example or even another example in your research as you identify this particular metric or outcome.
Yep.
How is that translating to economics?
Yeah. So at slaughter, I think there's two really good ones that are slightly different in what they demonstrate. So I think bruising is a really easy example of how something that can impact welfare can impact economics. So bruises on carcasses have to be taken out. They go to rendering. You might devalue other cuts. It takes a lot of extra time at the plant to kind of take out that bruised meat. And I think what we sometimes take for granted is like a bruise. Sure, we've all gotten bruises and they hurt, but I also think when you think about some of those bruises, think about that experience that animal had. Like, I don't think that we provided a great experience to an animal that shows up with a big bruise once it gets to slaughter. Yeah. So I think that's an easy one. I think mobility, so the way an animal moves through a plant, maybe is intuitively a little bit more about its welfare. So if it has poor mobility, probably not feeling great, taking longer, maybe a little more stress because it's a little bit farther back from its cohort. But I think that also impacts economics. This hasn't been quantified, although I think it could be, but it takes extra people, it takes extra time, there's gaps in the chain. And so I think there's a lot of things, if we just spend a little more time, we can really kind of show that return on investment for making those improvements.
Absolutely. So when you're thinking about mobility or bruising, what are the things that are contributing to those that you've identified? So clearly you're not just researching and saying, oh my goodness, this carcass has a bruise and it's a problem. You're likely going back and looking at root cause. How are you identifying those root causes? What does the research entail?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do think sometimes we just here's a problem, but we need to fix the problems in a practical way. So we just did a study. There's a lot of research looking at kind of the different parts of the pre-slaughter management process impacts meat quality. Also welfare, but there's some big ones that I think are missing. So for example, and I learned this when I worked in industry, but when trucks arrive at the plant, logistics aren't easy, right? And they wait on the trucks sometimes for a long time. Sometimes they get off really quickly. And so we did this kind of study. We benchmarked like 80,000 head of cattle. And for the most part, they're getting off pretty quick. There's some outliers that they're on there for a long time. And so we found that the longer they're on there, the poorer their mobility. And so I think that has kind of a cascade of effects as you kind of move through that slaughter process. And so to me, if we have identified that if we can target this one factor and make improvements, then we're going to improve this important outcome for welfare. I think minimizing wait time at the plant is something that we can feasibly do. We might not want to do it. It might not be easy, but I think we definitely can do it. Right. And so I think that's kind of, I don't know if that works as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're thinking about mobility, there's clearly an economic driver, for bruising or mobility, et cetera, logistics are complicated, but it is something that plants could focus on shortening or just at least acknowledging it as a key performance indicator, for example, in receiving. How are you communicating those kinds of results, both internal, perhaps to a company that was good enough to cooperate with 80,000 head. That's an impressive number. But then also externally.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel like that's the part that I probably need to take a deep breath and spend more time on, because, you finish one thing and you move to the next, and it's just continuing that pipeline. We've shared it a lot at kind of industry specific conferences. Of course, we write the papers, but I think sometimes that doesn't get to the end user as much. So I think it's having those intentional conversations with the change makers to kind of share that. And, we went to 5 plants. It's top secret who those plants are, but the plant themselves can kind of see how they kind of show next to the aggregate. And so I think a lot of times like that competitive part is really important, right? And so I think that's one way to kind of share that message as well.
Well, and lost margins are lost margins with competitors. So there's another, I think, economic driver for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
We did look at dart cutters too. That's a little bit harder because the frequency is pretty low. So, but we did look at some of that as well. But I think there's some opportunities that we could try to manage that from a scheduling again standpoint.
Sure. So absolutely.
That's cool. I probably have a ton of questions to ask Lily here. And one of the questions, and considering your diverse background, and you probably get a lot of different perceptions on animal welfare, right? We're talking about communicating animal welfare, how to communicate. How do people have different views? Like how animal welfare be different from person to person? How do we address that?
So I think that's a great point. And I feel like maybe more lately when I talk about that, I think like that's maybe one of the beautiful things about animal welfare is the different experiences and knowledge and background that we bring to the table. Because I think like between the three of us, probably 80% of what we would think is good welfare, like we're the same. And then there's kind of that different 20%, whereas I think like we often think about that as where we're all going to argue, but I think it might be where we can actually find some good things to try or share or change, because like our views of welfare can change too. So I find that like the uniqueness in people's views actually can make like more robust discussions about what good welfare means, if that makes sense.
And I heard you do a great job with this, with a more lay audience at the Women in Ranching, where you compared a feral cat to a shelter cat. Would you share that example? Because I do think it's just all about perspective. Right?
Yeah, no, I did that today too. And it was kind of, I did it in 2 classes and it was opposite. So I use that example, cats, because I think we all have had some experience with a cat, whether it's good or not. It's been an experience, right? So I compared like a good shelter. So a great shelter, great care. This cat has all the daily food and water it needs, great vet care, visual kind of exposure to other cats, one-on-one human interaction every day. But obviously it can't act like a cat all the time. It doesn't hunt. It doesn't fight with other cats. It doesn't do the good and the bad of being a cat. Compared to a feral cat that in the image I use looks like pretty good condition, good coat, has food in its mouth. So it is fed and it gets to express those positive hunting behaviors for the cat. It probably also gets to interact negatively with other cats. Doesn't have any vet care. Depending on the weather, depending on the shelter availability, it might not have that. And so I kind of posed the question to the class, or to the audience, which one has better welfare? And it's different almost every time, what people think. And then I try to compare it to a different type of animal too. So pigs is what I've been using, because I think oftentimes, like when we think about what our backgrounds are, we might think a cat should be housed this way, but a pig should be housed this way. So we flip flop the things that we value about an animal's welfare, just depending on the type of the animal. And it might be okay, but I think it also gives us a moment to pause and think why did we make that difference? And I think with that audience, it was a great exercise.
It was. They were split. Half thought that the feral cat had better welfare and half thought that the shelter cat had better welfare. And I think that's similar even for the free range pig versus the more traditionally confined housed pig. And it's just really interesting to hear you talk about it, because you're talking about the outcomes of the animal, which is, of course, what we should be focused on when we think about welfare. But even the trade-offs we make as people is just really fascinating. It's a fascinating science.
No, it's so nice because there's usually like an audience kind of think behind, which I don't even know how that happens, right? But today in one of the classes, they picked feral cat. They picked shelter cat, but then picked outdoor housing for pigs.
Interesting.
And so opposite, but then one student kind of mentioned, I understand like it was the space value, but it's different space. So like she like recognized the like intricacies of what actual space and opportunity is provided across those. And so I thought like, it's a good way to make people think about kind of what they share.
And it probably also plays a lot with our own background, right?
Yeah.
I want a comfortable zone scenario for myself.
Yep.
Maybe I think that shelter cat will be more comfortable if I put myself in their position, or the opposite. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think that's a little bit it. And so like if we had, longer in those sessions, it's like, okay, so you think a cat is going to value XYZ. Let's ask the cat, like not have it talk to us, but we can look at its behavior. We can look at its health. And I didn't provide any of that to them. So I think it's looking at what our perception is and then taking the science and taking those measurements and then kind of seeing how it matches up, or how we maybe could have changed a little bit how we approach that situation.
So that kind of leads into another question that we wanted to ask you, which is how do you assess the welfare of an animal, especially given the nuances of the biases that we have as people? Because that's clearly your job. I mean, you lead with science into a challenging, multifaceted, emotional topic.
Yeah, I think those emotions of all the things we think animals should have, which we anthropomorphize, you don't have to cut that out, I just can't say the word, I think probably those measurements are all valid. It's the interpretation of what they mean, I think, is where sometimes we lose it. That's what I kind of think. So we measure welfare in a lot of different ways. And so I think that's why sometimes it's hard when we're like, we have to pick one goal or two things that we're going to work on. Picking two measurements of animal welfare is super hard. It's like sustainability. I mean, it's complicated. Picking one isn't going to give you a good story of how the animal feels. So you really need this like holistic approach. And so I think that includes things related to basic health and function. So if we think about livestock too, like they're in facilities for a reason, right? So we want them to be healthy. We want them to be producing whatever it is they are, if it's weight gain or milk. And we want them to reproduce, not be stressed. That's like very physical component, but there's also a huge mental component to welfare. And I think that's where people get a little more nervous on how do we measure that.
Sure.
But a lot of the mental component of welfare is driven by, how an animal honestly feels in its environment. So if we are having an animal in an environment where it can't express behaviors that are highly motivated, for it to do, we might see some negative impacts. It might get frustrated. It might show stereotypical behaviors. It might lose weight, whatever that looks like. So I think that mental component is important. So that affective state. And then the third, and I'm stealing this from Fraser's 3 circles, but I think it's a really nice way to think about measurement, is called natural living. And so that doesn't mean that we put the animal in this natural environment and let it roam free. It means that we provide an animal with an environment that it has some ability to act to its nature. So I think that really hits home with like that cat example too. So we've provided it with an environment that the cat can be a cat, and that could be in a shelter and it could be when it's feral. It's just about the opportunities that we provide the animal in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you used that example with Women in Ranching with our equine sciences program that they are letting our CSU's therapy horses out into a very safe arena type scenario, but they do it a couple times a week for an hour or something. And that was a good example of, maybe this isn't always available to our domestic animals, but we can still give them this ability. Yeah.
I think that's like, to me, an easy thing. They figure out how they can manage it in their system. And it's providing that animal with that choice and control. It can sit in there and hang out by itself. It can go roll around. It can be with, the other horse that it gets along with. And so it kind of controls that environment, which I think is really important.
That's great.
I I have one other question on that note is, we've been talking a lot about the animals, but you also doing some research on the person working with the animals lately, right?
Yeah.
Can you just touch a little bit on that and how important is that, like the farm workers and research that you were working on?
Yeah, I think like surprisingly, I do a lot more work with humans right now than I do like looking at the animals. Animals will be next, but I think there's a huge synergy between human and animal welfare. And I think, if we can make situations better for the humans, which we want to do, I think that like just goes in hand with making it better for the animals. So we've done a couple different things. One, we just have finished up. We went to feedlots and asked, we did focus groups, so like group interviews, and we asked them, what do you think animal welfare means? Because asking the people that are doing that every day is probably something that would help us kind of inform how we present programs or management techniques. We asked about training, and we asked about job satisfaction. So one of the questions we asked was, what makes you proud of your job? Those were like the most heartfelt answers that I've ever heard. And a lot of it was transporters and feed yard employees, was about they feel such a care and responsibility towards the animals, especially the transporters were like, this is their last ride. Like I owe it to them. So, I mean, it was like, I don't cry a lot, but I was like getting like teary-eyed with those. So, and then we're working on another one, which I know we've kind of chatted about, looking at end-of-life decisions. So euthanasia, fitness for transport to slaughter. And so talking to the people at the dairies, calf ranches, sale barns, and slaughter plants, like, what do you think about euthanasia? Do you have all the resources you need? How does it make you feel? Do you think all cows should go to slaughter? And so I think we're going to have tons of information come out across that.
That's
cool. Awesome.
Yeah, I'm like super excited about that project.
And so here at AgNext, we work with sustainable solutions for animal agriculture. Can you just explain a little bit how animal welfare ties back? You mentioned the 3 pillars of sustainability. Yeah. How does that tie back to sustainable solutions for animal agriculture and animal welfare? Yeah,
so I mean, animal welfare is kind of part of one of those pillars, right? Yep. It's part of the social pillar. I think it's with the people. So I think, again, that human-animal interaction is really important to sustainability. I think if you don't have an animal that's in good welfare in a system, it's going to eventually not be sustainable. And so I think, it's a core part of how we approach sustainable solutions.
Yeah, and it could be impacting in the environment negatively because their feed efficiency is going down or, whatever. Yeah. I agree. Yep. It's critical.
Yeah.
Critical.
That's pretty cool. So I think now we can go to some more personal questions. Okay. We started with your background and now we can come back a little bit. So I will ask you like how you mentioned a little bit about Temple. You started saying something about when you reach out to her, how important has been mentorship in your career and how important is for you to guide students as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like probably I think about this. I don't think I intentionally think enough about it, right? Like I think mentorship is such a huge part of how we got to where we are and of like what we do in our current roles. So obviously, I mean, Temple has been a wonderful mentor. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. She picked up the phone. I called her. It was like landline, still time ancient years ago. I called her on a weekend thinking like, oh, I'll just leave a message. But she picked up. And so she took a chance on this like girl from Rhode Island who didn't know anything about agriculture, never been to a feedlot, never been to a packing plant, never been to a sow barn. And so, I mean, she took a real chance. And so I think that's important for us to do too. We have more and more people that don't have experience in agriculture. And sometimes that means like not even having seen a cow. It's not even like, I went to petting zoos, but like some people haven't even seen that exposure. And so I think it's really important to be open. And I think rather than thinking of people asking these questions, like they're asking questions, they're questioning, I think it's like exciting, right? They want to know what we do, which is a great thing. And then I think I realize like how much of a mentor I am to my graduate students. So I'm, a successful woman in agriculture, and I think that didn't come without hardship. And so I think I like indirectly kind of show them how they can also be that too. And to me, that's maybe one of the most meaningful things I could actually give them because it took me a while to figure that out.
That's good.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you've had such a remarkable career. So it's inspiring to be here in the same department as you. And thank you again for being willing to come to the podcast.
Of course.
Yeah, I will just finish with our most important question that we always ask our guests.
Yes.
And I'm curious to hear your perspective and answering this question, just because you have such a nice and diverse background. So the question is, how do you define sustainability?
Great. This is like a tough
There's
question.
no wrong answer.
Well, I get an F on my exam. I like to get
0.
straight A's. So I got a 0 already. Yeah. I'm excited to hear my answer too. So I think it's like a balancing act. So you have all these kind of competing interests, but you also have these synergies. And so I think it's about finding the synergies and the win-wins between what's socially important, environmentally important, and economically important. And it's doing that in a way that, makes the operation viable at the moment, but also viable and thriving in the future. So that would be my definition.
Well done. Yeah, A+, I feel. That's good.
Pedro looks like he's going to grade tougher than that. But
No, I like that. Okay. I really like that, and I agree with you. Last but not least, how if anybody wants to reach out to you, how can they reach out to you if they want to? If they probably won't call you like you did.
Like a landline. I still have a landline at my house, but
but if there's a student or a producer or somebody reaching out to you, how they can contact you. And what I know, I keep saying the last question, and I have one. What is the future for animal welfare? Where do you see the future research on animal welfare? And then you can leave with your also contact information.
Okay. That's like a bunch of questions all wrapped into one. So where do I see the future going? I think that it's about continual improvement. So I think sometimes people get frustrated. They're like, well, we just made this change and we just improved this. But there always is going to be another thing, because as humans, we want to get better and better and better at everything. And so I think it's just approaching animal welfare in the spirit of wanting to do things better. And I think in the space of sustainability, it's trying to identify more of those win-wins, because I think the trade-offs and sometimes the negative things, you decrease welfare and then have issues with environmental. I think those are obvious and they get depressing. So let's try to find the positive ones, which, coming from me, I'm not like the most positive person, but I think that's where we kind of need to look, is where can we find those win-wins?
Perfect. And how can people reach out to you now?
And now I have to answer that question. I think probably email is the best. And then I'm always happy to get on a phone call, have a meeting, whatever that looks like. And my email is long and I have an annoying hyphenated last name. So, join the club.
It's probably available in Animal Science.
Yeah, website. It's totally available online. Just Google Lily and you'll find it.
Perfect.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Lily, for being here. I'm so excited to see the soon to be published, hopefully, research, or maybe we'll get a sneak peek on some of the people stuff. That would be fun to do another podcast on just that. So with that, thank you for joining us on another episode of the AgNext Podcast, where we'll always be talking about what's next on AgNext. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn.
If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, any feedback that you would like to give to us, please send an email to agnext.colostate.edu, and we'll do our best to answer you as soon as we can. Thank you.